Hello, welcome to Civitalks. My name is Maggie, and I will be a freshman at College of the Holy Cross in the fall.
I'm Sophie. I'll be a sophomore at Boston College.
I'm Claire. I'll be a senior at McKinley Classical Leadership Academy.
I'm Katie. I'll be a senior at Lafayette High School.
I'm Claire. I'll be a second year at the University of Chicago.
And I'm Gabe. I will be a freshman at St. Olaf College.
And we have a number of things to talk about, but we want to start with our recognition of the lack of youth representation on our local TV show Donnybrook. So, as there's not much age diversity on this panel, we are encouraging more adults and programs in our everyday life to hear out what young people have to say. We often are victims of ageism. It's not just the elderly, it can be young people. And we want to be in the forefront of matters that pertain to us. So I want to direct this to Claire. What do you think about ageism? Are we victims of it? Is it important for young people to be involved in matters that pertain to them? Should older people with more experience decide things for young people?
I think that young people don't have enough of a say, but also I think that young people do have a voice, and I think that in the past it makes sense that people weren't necessarily listening to young people because there were a lot of matters that didn't, like, it wasn't necessarily as relevant. It wasn't necessarily as necessary for our future. I mean, everything is just so urgent now. Our world is dying, and we're just, it's really, really urgent right now, and so we need to be included in the conversation.
I agree. I think that we still need to acknowledge the fact that older people who have actually been to college, are experienced in the field, they should be the leaders here. Like, I'm not saying like us as youth, but we should be involved in the conversation, especially when it affects us with issues like at our school board. If something directly impacts us, if we're actually going to be paying the consequences, I think we should be a part of the conversation. But we shouldn't overlook the fact that these people are professionals. They have been doing this way longer than we have, some before we were even born, and they should be probably the forefront.
Yeah, and I know I know people have a tendency to say, oh, well, we have access to more information than ever before in human history, which is true, and yeah, there's more raw information available at a much easier format, but information does not equal knowledge. It's one thing to know something, it's another thing to then apply that and like genuinely use that beyond like, oh, Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States of America. It's one thing to just have that raw information, but the sort of notion and the action of like putting that to work is something that I think genuinely comes from experience that a lot of times the youth just kind of don't have because, well, they're the youth. Like, they just haven't had the experience yet. There just wasn't the time yet and their own experiences to be able to sort of put that knowledge to work.
Don't get me wrong, I don't think that kids are like more experienced, but I do think that like social media, Instagram, Twitter, like Snapchat, all of that has actually given us a lot more experience than previous generations had when they were our age. I know personally everything I do on the internet, at least I know I'm very like unique in this way. I don't think many high schoolers do this, but I think about how this will make me look in the future. I think about it and I acknowledge the fact that what I'm doing now, I have eyes on me 24/7, so I have to be more mature and I have to look at what I'm doing. And the idea of like having technology around us all the time growing up kind of put us in a sense of we have a lot of experience. And honestly, in certain ways, we're more experienced than older generations with stuff like technology.
But you also have to ask yourself, yes, the youth voice is important, but at the same time, how much of their opinions are dictated by the opinions of their parents?
That's very true.
And because you can have children who are raised liberal or children who are raised conservative, and it's the most absurd thing to even think about having different political views from their parents. So as much as you want to say, yeah, these kids are informed, what social media are they paying attention to? Are they only watching Fox News? Are they only watching CNN? Like, how opinionated are their sources of information? And especially, like, when you think about things like racism, things that are taught within the house that you don't even realize you're learning from your parents. So you might think, you're dictating your own decisions and you're coming up with your own opinions, but how much of that is bandwagon stuff, and you're just liking AOC because she's young, but you don't actually know her stance on policies and things like that. So there's got to be some sort of line between, yeah, it's important to listen to the youth voice, but at the same time, how much of that is just them believing what their parents are saying to them?
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, speaking of the youth voice, there are plenty of issues that the youth can all take a stand on. For example, consolidation of the city and the county into a single entity. It's been in the talks for some time. In the past 100 years, they've tried, if I'm not mistaken, 5 times to reunite them both, and it's failed every time at some point along the path. So, Katie, I want to ask you this. If the city and the county do reform themselves into a single entity, does that actually change anything? Does that actually help people? Or does it just sort of realign all the ratios to be more true, but not actually change what's going on?
I truly think there's just not enough data to find out for sure if there's going to be actually helpful by merging the city and the county. Obviously, we'll never know until we do it, like the true actual impact, because we can have the statistics too. We can have examples like with Louisville, places in Indiana, like other places have merged, but that's not St. Louis. St. Louis is very unique. St. Louis is very different. We have history of segregation and like racial issues that will, like, obviously aren't really like sure, like, helps complicate the situation of merging the city and the county, and even just the county in itself as an entity. So I think that before we even say, like, yes, it's good or bad, we need to do research. We have to figure out the actual information, get the data, and then start putting it into effect.
There's pros and cons to everything, and so I feel like there's pros and cons to being separate, there's pros and cons to merging. And I think what we've talked about, we've pulled many different individuals from Soulard to Kirkwood, and they all have different opinions. And I think what's going to be vital in this conversation is fixing the problems that we currently have to prevent future problems, and then possibly if we can fix the issues that are going on in the county and the city, then we can have a successful merge. But again, we need data and reforms to do that.
Can I ask a sort of general question? Anyone can respond to this if they'd like. If the only way to know for sure how a merger would affect the greater St. Louis area was to merge the greater St. Louis area, if that's the only foolproof way in order to figure out what would happen, would you merge the two?
Yes. I would. I think we've had individual problems. We've had a city and county that's been divided, and it's become a greater incidence of the racism in our city and in our county. Our county is now, white flight. And how do you keep doing that? Well, at some point, you have to merge the city and the county. At some point, you have to combine resources, because individually, we've been trying for 100 years, and we've never tackled this problem. So what makes us think that another 100 years of individualism is going to work? That's kind of like beating a dead horse. We have to try something new, and so I say we try the city-county merger. We know better together wasn't the way to do that. All right, they had good data. If you read through it, their data is actually pretty decent. It's the proposal itself that's the problem. We take their data, we build a proposal, we talk to the city, we talk to the county, we make the best proposal, and we do it. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, well, we're already at a different place than we were. Now we start over.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think Better Together definitely had its problems, but one of the biggest problems was the fact that it was supposed to be a statewide vote.
Yes.
I don't agree with that. I don't know if any of you, how you feel about that, but I don't agree that something that affects St. Louis City and St. Louis County should be decided on by the entire state of Missouri.
I agree. And I also think a big issue with the idea of the mergers, is, at least in the county, is that everyone's so prideful in their municipality, their individual city, that's them, they're being treated by it, and not a lot of people are willing to give up that feeling of a small community for an even bigger one, I feel like.
One of the proposed actions in Better Together in a merger is combining school districts, and we talk about education reform. And so unique to Missouri as well is that we have a requirement to pass a constitutional test, and we have some form of civics education, whether that be in public or private schools. But I want to ask, is civics necessary? I think it is, because I think we need to provide a foundation for young generations to be informed, how to vote, what our basics of democracy and government are. But are there better ways to do that than what we currently have? Sophie,
Uh,
what do you think?
I am a history major, and I'm going to say that I think individually civics is absolutely important. However, until you teach history, until you understand where you're coming from, until you understand the meaning of civics, so we can argue about, let's say, the Second Amendment all we want, but until you know the history of that amendment, your argument means absolutely nothing because your context is completely missing. And I think that's the problem with our Constitution test and our civics engagement right now, is we're teaching it from the perspective of whoever your teacher is, whoever your parents are, whatever their beliefs are, that's what you believe your civic engagement is. There's no common core way to model civics. And until you do that, until you have history combined with the civics, you're going to get kids who memorize the information, pass their Constitution test with 60%, they're good to go, and they're going to keep doing it. And no matter what you do, that's not going to increase our actual civic engagement. It's just a class, and it's just kids taking a class.
I completely agree. As like same way as any education, like it's all about the teacher. Like if you have a great teacher, like I had a great gov teacher, and she taught us like this is how you care about being in government, and she made everyone engaged and everyone enjoyed being in her class. Meanwhile, the teacher, like, because I was in like AP government, but the kids who were in like regular government, because there was no like middle ground, they were just like given a packet, here's the information, memorize the information, the test is the packet with fill-in words, like they all get 100, but they don't learn anything. Information is not retaining. So there needs to be more than just like taking a test. There needs to be a required like actually getting children like engaged in the situation.
I agree. I mean, all of us are civics kids. That's why we're here. That's why we're discussing current
Exactly.
issues. We would enjoy learning about it. I think we would also enjoy a service component to citizenship or civics. But think about all of us in a class we don't like math. You take the test and the information's gone. And I think that's the problem with our education system in general, especially with civics, is it's such a hands-on thing where you have to take the ideas and you have to apply them and you have to go vote. And kids who aren't interested are going to stop at the information.
So I don't necessarily know that sort of makes it less worthy though. Like just because there's always going to be kids that won't enjoy the class. Like that's just the way like demographics shake out. Like you'll always there's always going to be kids that enjoy math less than English or vice versa. So the idea that there will be a group of kids that don't necessarily care for the civics to me doesn't outweigh the sort of utility that having the civics can bring.
I think the historical side of Sophie's argument is very, very central to the argument because, one, you can have kids who memorize all the amendments in the Constitution, and you have people who are like, oh, yeah, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and there are people who learn that and don't learn the history behind the 13th Amendment and the fact that it didn't do that much for black people in the country, and that people to this day will say, oh, we abolished slavery, racism isn't a thing. And like with memorization, you memorize the 13th Amendment, you memorize the 14th and the 15th Amendment or the 19th Amendment, and you think the problem's done like that because you memorize that it happened, it got passed, voila, it became law, and problems disappeared because you don't learn the history behind these things. You don't learn where they came from and why it was necessary to pass that law.
So we know that there's a lot of problems with St. Louis, and one of them has been a really tough history with race. But why would somebody come back from going away to college, or is there a reason that people leave St. Louis for college and or a career?
I would say with me about to go off to the East Coast, and some of us who have left would say that St. Louis, I was born and raised here. I do feel a connection, and I do feel kind of a responsibility to come back and to fix the problems that I've seen in my lifetime here, and then also the deep-rooted problems that have been here since its origin. And I would say that there is value in going away and kind of being at a different place in the country, because I am often shocked at how different the United States can be. And whether that be Midwest, East Coast, South, what have you. And so I think there is some opportunities and experiences that are very valid and valuable in going away and experiencing the problems in another city, and then being able to compare that to, let's say, St. Louis, and then maybe those problems were solved in that city and we can implement those in St. Louis. And so I think that it's not bad to go away, but I think it's important to kind of remember your roots and to find ways progressive, unique ways that we can fix the issues that are here. So there is value in leaving, but there's as equally as valid as coming back.
So do you think that you would come back no matter what?
It depends. Growing up in this day and age and just the housing market and the job availability, it would really depend. I mean, there's cities growing, and I hope St. Louis is on that list, but sometimes we do have trouble with job availability. But also housing and the standard of living in other cities is outrageous compared to St. Louis.
I'm obviously going into my senior year, and I'm looking at colleges, and obviously I'm looking at the East Coast as well, specifically around Maryland and DC, and I'm having issues with like internal turmoil because I'm from St. Louis. I was born here, I was raised here, I love this city with my whole heart, but there's this weird mix of I want to come back, but I also don't want to come back. I want to go out into the world, experience a ton of different things, but I always will know that St. Louis is my home, and I know what you mean with this sense of responsibility to your city, especially now that I'm more civically engaged with my city through things like Civitas and everything I get from like this internship, and it's hard to actually grasp that idea of leaving or coming back.
Yeah, I am also going far for college, and I sort of fully intend on returning whether or not things get better or worse when I'm up there. And I feel like if things do get worse, I would feel almost more obligated to return, because it's one thing for things to go bad, but it's another for things to go bad and stay bad because nobody's trying to fix them. And if I'm just sort of abandoning St. Louis because things are bad, like that to me feels like I'm just leaving because things are bad and I don't want to put in the effort and the time to fix things, which I understand people not wanting to do that because it's hard and it's not easy, but I think because it's hard and because it's not easy and because I love St. Louis enough, I'm coming back regardless of that.
Look, I left, I went to the East Coast, and I had no intention of coming back. I was like, St. Louis has been good, but the history I want to study, the stuff I want to do, has to happen on the East Coast. I was out there for a year, and throughout that year, I've decided there's a duty when you leave, and you have to come back. Because everybody's always, oh, you're from St. Louis, or people are embarrassed to say they're from St. Louis, or they're from Missouri. Own it. You have a duty to your city, you have a duty to your state. If you don't like it, you don't get to leave. If you leave, then, all right, then you don't claim that anymore. You don't get to be embarrassed by your hometown. You don't get to complain about it. You have to come back, and you have to fix it. Because if you don't, no one else is going to. So now, after being out there for a year, despite the fact that American Revolution took place out there, I'm coming back. Because this is my city, and I have to fix it, or nobody else will.
And on that note, St. Louis may have some issues here and there, but one thing we got is sports, baby. Flying Gloria. So, Sophie, as you see, we have a lot of St. Louis pride, specifically in our sports. We're a beautiful city with great sports. And, we have baseball, we have hockey. Now, there's talking about adding a soccer stadium. And what's your idea of adding a soccer stadium, whereas, some people might argue adding an NBA team?
I would say add them both. I think we can do a 4-sport city. I think we have enough people who... We have the space. We have a lot of dedicated sports fans. We have the whole one team thing that's going on right now, where you got the Cardinals and the Blues together. If we have to pick one, I'm going to say soccer, just because both the National Women's Soccer League and the Major League Soccer is looking to expand, and the NBA is not. So we either buy a basketball team or we get an expansion team, and I think it's a lot more likely that we're going to get an expansion team than buying one. And I also think soccer in 2015 has the highest rated viewed game. That was bigger than the NBA, that was bigger than the Stanley Cup. So I think that's just what's more popular. But honestly, if we can get both, we can get both. We like our teams flashy, we like our teams with an edge, and both soccer and basketball have plenty of potential for that.
And soccer...
Go ahead.
Oh, no, you go.
Okay, it's very interesting because that game in 2015 was actually for the women's team. So me, personally, I think that if we were to bring a soccer team here, I would prefer for it to be female. And especially, I don't think the Ambush or St. Louis FC are necessary. So if we were to bring a soccer team, I would want those two out. But that's just how I feel.
on top of that, with the whole idea of adding an NBA team versus soccer, like let's say it's one or the other, there's a interesting thing someone brought up that if we add an NBA team, it could help the African American community here in St. Louis. What's any of you guys' thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, with any sports, a big factor into who ends up playing that sport is the price point to get into that sport. So compare just the two sports we have in St. Louis right now, the hockey and baseball. What do you need to be able to play hockey? You need skates, you need pads, you need a stick.
Access
you
to an
need
ice rink.
Access to an ice rink. You need to know how to skate. You need all of these different things that drive up the sort of price of admission into hockey. Compare that to even just baseball. What do you need for baseball? You need,
A diamond.
at most, a stick and a ball. You can, depending on how much sort of extra stuff you want to get, how true to the sport you want to get, well, then you get actual bats, you get baseballs, you get bases. But even just that is a dramatically lower price point to get into, and you can play that with just a stick and a ball that you find. It's the same with soccer. You can play soccer with any
Exactly.
sort of ball-shaped object. You could play it with a basketball, for crying out loud.
So in that terms, like basketball and soccer are even more simpler. And we've talked about this before of how soccer and any other sport can be a form of uniting people across racial, political, any boundaries and backgrounds. And we saw that with Cardinals Nation. We built this huge ballpark village that has, I believe, has been good for this city. And I feel like if we get one of these teams to come in, St. Louis is a growing city, as I said. And so if we can get more people coming and investing in the city, then we can really solve the problems that we have here. Not all of them, of course, and it's not one solution, but it could help.
And Ballpark Village was the foundation for those 2 new apartment buildings that they're putting right next to Busch Stadium, which means that there's more space for people to live.
All right, so now that we've discussed things on the local level, let's take a more national outlook on the situation. So I'm going to direct this question to Gabe. So recently there's been uproar about a mural in a California public school. It features George Washington because it's at George Washington High School. And this painting has George Washington, and it also pictures a dead Native American being stepped over by white males and a few African American slaves who are doing dirty work necessarily. So how do you feel about this mural? Do you think it should be taken down, removed, kept up? What do you think?
Well, so first of all, art does not belong to the artist, in the sense that, yes, the artist is who creates it, and obviously it's that person's work, but art is decided by the viewer. It's up to the viewer to look at something and say, oh, that's art, that's not art, that is art because of this, that's not art because of that. It's up to the viewer to determine those things, and by extension, it's up to the viewer to determine how they feel about that art. If they say, like, yes, that's art, it's also super racist art, like, that is a valid claim by the viewer that the artist doesn't necessarily have the ability to do. Like, all artists, by extension, are viewers of art too, so they have their own view of their own art. But ultimately, it comes down to the viewer's perspective. So I don't necessarily think that their perspective on the art is flawed in any way. It's a valid perspective to have. Personally, I don't believe that art is the type of thing where you can then decide what's valid art and what's invalid art. I think that all art is sort of inherently valid, partially because you can debate what is actually art. And my response to hearing that was, if you see a piece of art that offends you, ask, why does it offend you? Because it's one thing to paint a piece of art that's sort of explicitly like offensive. It's one thing to sort of say, going into it, I'm going to create this art piece that's just going to be sort of wildly inappropriate for the sake of being inappropriate. I'm creating this to make shock, versus I'm creating this to display historical context that's super messed up and super unpleasant to witness, but
should you have to witness that every day? Should you have to walk past that as you're going to class? Should you have to be confronted with a traumatic history every time that you're trying to just go about your daily life? It's too much.
That's where the problem, I think, lies. Is this is a mural in a high school, and the people actually outspoken about not wanting it in their high school is the African American and Native American students, and I think that's something we should definitely be thinking about. One thing, though, because this was a $500,000 mural that was put up, and it would cost probably multiple thousands to take it to paint over it as well. What if instead of taking it down, we invest that money to actually help promote these communities and help educate this school, those students that pass by it, what that mural is talking about, and actually educate the kids on the situation instead of maybe painting over and erasing the history?
I don't think that it's the government's job to contextualize art, because how the government decides to contextualize art is a product of that government, not necessarily a product of that art, because all art is a product of its time, and all government is a product of its time. So what you effectively have is art that is contextualized in a certain situation being prescribed a context by a government that exists in a certain situation, and that gets really, really messy in terms of like how valid that contextualization actually is.
But what makes you think that the government would even pay for education like this? I mean, it's probably not the government that's paying to wash or to clean up this mural. It would probably be independent donors and the people who donate to the school board. Because, I mean, a lot of schools don't even just get their fund, like, a lot of schools have donations and donors. So I don't think it'd be the government that'd be paying to create this. And I think what they should instead do with the money to cover it up, or what if the people that don't want it to be covered up should do, is to donate for the school to make a new entrance, or to have, like, something so that the students don't have to walk past this. Make this a truly public art piece, shut down that wing of the school, and have it be a public exhibit.
Look, it's history, and if we really got rid of every piece of history that made people mad, we wouldn't have history classes.
Yes.
We wouldn't be able to teach anything. We can barely teach the founding fathers right now because they all have problems. I love John Adams. I'm the first to admit he was racist, Abigail Adams was racist, and the Alien and Sedition Acts were bad. Was that so hard? No! These people are human beings. We all have mistakes that we made, and I think the point of history and the point of art is that it teaches things that we are uncomfortable learning. And if we start covering that up, and if we start taking it down, we're never going to learn. Ever.
And these conversations are important. And so we've had a lot of good conversations today, and it's just important to keep these going. So with that, thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to hearing your responses.